because I wanted to mention a little bit more about what that means for it to be a supernatural manifestation of God's power or miracle. Because a lot of Christians have a misconception about that. A lot of folks think that God created the universe and it sort of runs like a clock. It sort of runs on its own, and then a miracle or supernatural activity would be when God sort of steps in and intervenes with that machine. That really is not a biblical view. The biblical view is that God constantly upholds the universe by the word of his power. Hebrews 1:3 teaches that. And so the universe is not something that can operate independent from God. It can't. God is constantly upholding it. God is causing the universe to behave in the way that it does. Wrap your mind around that for a moment. Every electron around every atom in your body, the reason it orbits that way is because God's making it orbit that way. That's awesome. You can't even keep track of that, and yet God's causing it. And there's this misconception, well, we don't need God anymore because we know that atoms are held together by forces of electromagnetism and the planets are held together by gravity. There are these laws of nature that explain that. Laws of nature are not a replacement for God's power. They're an example of God's power. Okay? Gravity is not something that exists independent from God. Gravity is the name we give to the fact that God causes things to move in that way. And so this idea that the universe can exist on its own and it's its own entity and then God intervenes is not a biblical position. That's sort of a quasi-deistic position. The biblical position is that God upholds everything, and he normally does it in a very consistent and predictable way, which we call laws of nature. Laws of nature are descriptions of the normal, consistent way that God upholds his creation. That's how I, as a Christian, would define laws of nature. They're not something that God created. They're descriptions for what God does. Okay, the way he normally upholds the universe. And you might say, well, how can that be? Because they seem impersonal and they seem very mathematical. Well, that tells you something about how God thinks. God thinks very mathematically, and he upholds the universe in a consistent way for our benefit. Because it would be impossible to do science if he didn't. It would be impossible to do technology if God were constantly changing the way he upheld things. He does it in a consistent way for our benefit so that we can understand the universe and harness it in many respects. So my point here is that laws of nature are not a replacement for God's power. They are God's power. They're a description of what God normally does. A supernatural action, therefore, would be when God does something in an unusual way. He does something different that goes beyond the normal, consistent way that he upholds the universe. And so it's interesting to me that the atheist demands a miracle from God. He says if God would stop the rotation of the earth right now for, say, a day, which God has done, by the way, and he can do that. He says, if that happened, then I'd believe in God. That would prove to me that God exists. I would say, no. It's not the violation of laws of nature that demonstrate God's existence. It's the laws of nature that demonstrate God's existence, you see. It's the fact that the earth does orbit in a way that's predictable and so on. The fact that the sun will rise tomorrow is proof of God. The secular philosopher David Hume was utterly stumped on this issue. If you think I'm just making this up, and no, scholars have come up with secular explanations for why there's this uniformity in nature. No, they haven't. Read David Hume. He's an atheist, and he tried to come up with an atheistic explanation for how it is we can know that the sun will rise tomorrow, and he couldn't. And it'll do no good to say, well, it always has, because unless you assume that there's already uniformity in nature, and therefore what has happened is a good predictor of what will happen, then you can't make any assumptions about just because it was that way, it'll be that way in the future. You can't assume that unless you already knew about uniformity some other way. It's only the Christian God who's beyond time, who's in a position to tell us what the future will be like, and in fact actively controls the future, who's in a position to tell us, yes, I'm going to uphold things in a consistent way, which he's promised in Genesis 8:22, that the basic cycles of nature will be in the future as they have been in the past as long as the earth remains. But of course, God is free to do things in a small way that temporarily, he can uphold the universe in a temporarily different way to accomplish something extraordinary, which he sometimes does.